Officer Rachel Martinez had been with the Houston Police Department for 7 years, but nothing could have prepared her for the call that came through on that sweltering August afternoon. The prison warden's voice was steady but urgent. A prisoner on death row, Marcus Thompson, had requested her presence specifically. She didn't know him. She'd never worked his case. Yet somehow, he knew her name, her badge number, and insisted that only she could help him fulfill his final wish before his execution scheduled for midnight. Rachel's hands trembled as she drove toward the maximum security facility. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the highway, mirroring the heat of questions burning in her mind. Why her? What could a condemned man possibly want from someone he'd never met? Her partner had warned her not to go, said it was probably some twisted game. But something deep in her gut told her this was different. This mattered. When she arrived at the prison, the guards led her through corridor after corridor of cold concrete and steel bars. The sound of her boots echoed against the walls, each step taking her deeper into a world she'd only seen from the outside. Inmates watched her pass, their faces pressed against cell bars, whispering and pointing. She kept her head high, her hand instinctively resting near her service weapon, though she knew it had been secured at the entrance. Finally, they reached the isolation wing. Marcus Thompson sat in a small cell, hands cuffed, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit. But his eyes held something she hadn't expected. Not hatred, not defiance, just an overwhelming sadness mixed with desperate hope. When he looked up at her, his first words made her blood run cold. "Officer Martinez, I know who killed your sister." Rachel's world tilted on its axis. Her sister, Emma, had been murdered 8 years ago during a convenience store robbery in downtown Houston. The case had gone cold within months. No witnesses came forward. No evidence pointed to anyone specific. The detectives had eventually moved on to newer cases, leaving Rachel with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. She joined the police force partly because of Emma, hoping to find answers, to bring someone to justice. But the trail had long since gone dead. Now, sitting across from a convicted murderer hours before his execution, she struggled to process his words. Her training told her to be skeptical, to recognize manipulation when she saw it. Death row inmates often played mind games, grasping at anything to delay the inevitable. But Marcus's expression held no hint of deception. His voice was calm, measured, almost peaceful. He explained that he'd been in that convenience store the night Emma died. He wasn't the shooter, but he'd been there, a witness to everything. "I was buying cigarettes," Marcus said quietly, his cuffed hands folded on the metal table between them. "I saw the whole thing. 2 men came in, demanded money from the cashier. Your sister was just in the wrong place." She tried to help the cashier, grabbed her phone to call 911. One of them panicked and fired. I ran. I was on parole then, scared if I came forward. They'd pin it on me. I've carried that guilt every single day since. Rachel's throat tightened. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he'd stayed silent while her family fell apart. Her mother had died 2 years after Emma, heartbroken and hollow. Her father barely spoke anymore, lost in his own private hell. This man could have given them closure, could have helped them begin to heal. Instead, he'd chosen silence. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw genuine remorse etched into every line of his weathered face. And she saw something else. He was finally ready to tell the truth. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The names he gave her were like bombs exploding in her mind. Derek Simmons and Trevor Hayes. Both were known associates of a drug operation that had operated in Houston's east side for years. Both had managed to stay just beyond the law's reach, connected enough to have protection, smart enough to avoid major charges. And according to Marcus, both had walked free while an innocent woman's murder remained unsolved. But here was the problem. Marcus was scheduled for execution at midnight. It was now 4 in the afternoon. Rachel had 8 hours to verify his story, find evidence, and potentially reopen a case that had been gathering dust for nearly a decade. The warden made it clear that nothing would stop the execution unless she brought back something concrete. Texas didn't halt executions based on stories alone. She needed proof, witnesses, something tangible that could stand up in court. Rachel made a decision that could cost her career. She grabbed her phone and started calling in every favor she'd ever earned. Her former partner, Detective James Chen, met her in the prison parking lot within 30 minutes. She brought him up to speed as they raced back to Houston, sirens blaring. They pulled files from the evidence room, files that hadn't been touched in years. Emma's case folder was thin, heartbreakingly so. But tucked inside were crime scene photos, witness statements, and one crucial detail they'd missed before. The convenience store's old security system had been outdated even then, but there had been a bank ATM across the street. Banks kept their surveillance footage longer than most businesses. If that footage still existed somewhere in archive storage, it might show the two men leaving the scene. It might show Marcus running away. It might prove he was telling the truth. James made calls while Rachel drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every minute that ticked by was a minute closer to midnight, a minute closer to potentially losing the only witness who could finally give Emma justice. At 6:30 p.m., they hit gold. An older bank manager remembered the incident and, more importantly, remembered that all footage from that year had been transferred to digital archives during a system upgrade. He met them at the bank, unlocking doors and navigating through layers of digital storage that most people didn't even know existed. Rachel stood behind him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. James paced the small security room, checking his watch every few seconds. The footage loaded slowly, agonizingly slowly. Then, there it was. August 15th, 2017, 11:43 p.m. The timestamp matched the coroner's report exactly. The angle from the ATM camera captured the convenience store's entrance perfectly. Rachel watched through tears as two men rushed out, one of them stuffing something into his jacket. 30 seconds later, Marcus Thompson emerged, looking back fearfully before sprinting down the street in the opposite direction. The quality was grainy, but facial recognition software could work with it. They copied the footage and raced to the district attorney's office. Rachel called ahead, explaining the situation, pleading for someone to listen. The DA himself, Richard Lawson, agreed to meet them. He was skeptical at first, his weathered face showing every year of tough cases and harder decisions. But as he watched the footage, something shifted in his expression. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. Within minutes, they had warrants to bring in Derek Simmons and Trevor Hayes for questioning. The next hour was chaos. Police units fanned out across Houston, searching for 2 men who'd thought themselves safe from a crime committed years ago. Marcus Thompson sat in his cell, probably praying, probably wondering if his final act of conscience would matter. Rachel stood in the observation room as first Derek, then Trevor, were brought in for questioning. Both men had records. Both had been arrested multiple times for drug-related offenses. Neither had ever been connected to Emma's murder. Until now, the clock showed 9:15 p.m. They had less than 3 hours before the execution would proceed. Rachel knew they needed a confession, needed something definitive. And then, watching through the one-way glass, she saw Derek Simmons break. Derek Simmons cracked under pressure from video evidence and persistent questioning. He admitted everything. Trevor Hayes had been the shooter, but Derek had been there, had been part of the robbery, had helped cover up the crime. He gave details only someone who'd been present could know. The location where they disposed of the gun, the amount of money they'd taken, the fact that Emma had been wearing a silver bracelet with a small heart charm, something that had been mentioned in the police report but never released to the public. At 10:45 p.m., D.A. Lawson made the call to the governor's office. Rachel sat in the waiting room, exhausted, emotionally drained, but somehow more whole than she felt in 8 years. The governor issued a stay of execution at 11:12 p.m., 48 minutes before Marcus Thompson was scheduled to die. It wasn't a pardon, but it was time. Time to properly investigate his claims about his own case. Time to review whether justice had truly been served in his conviction. Time to ensure the right people pay for the right crimes. Rachel returned to the prison just after midnight. Marcus was back in his cell, no longer in the execution chamber. When he saw her, tears streamed down his face. She told him about Derek's confession, about the arrest, about how Emma's case was finally solved. She told him that he'd given her family something they'd lost 8 years ago, the truth. His last wish hadn't been for himself. It had been to set right the one wrong he could still fix before leaving this world. "Thank you," she whispered through the bars, her own tears falling freely now. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. They stood there in silence for several minutes, 2 people connected by tragedy and redemption. As Rachel walked out of the prison that night, the Texas sky was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. She called her father for the first time in months. When he answered, his voice thick with sleep, she simply said, "Dad, we found them. We found the men who killed Emma." The sound of a father's sob, released after years of holding everything inside, told her that Marcus Thompson's final wish had done more than solve a crime. It had begun to heal the wounds that had never properly closed, giving her family permission to finally, truly grieve and eventually move forward. Justice, Rachel realized, sometimes came from the most unexpected places.